Thank you very much for having me this, afternoon for you, late evening for me. Um, Also thanks to Xichen for making the homepage and everything work. Um, and a shout out to my collaborators. So the talk that I'm gonna give today is not just my own work, but it's a large collaboration across fields, across countries, and it's certainly not something I could have done alone. And while the topic of the talk is multi-species sustainability, I will try to put in a few references to urban planning and city design, given that the ECOLOPES project is very much on this topic, and I think it's a good fit. So let's get started. I'm gonna basically skip the self-introduction because Ferdinand did that already. Thank you very much for that. Um, And I'd like to get started thinking a little bit through concepts. First, kind of as a frame, how we might be able to escape the very much urban dominated Anthropocene that we're currently living in. And one of the main ideas that is shaping the Anthropocene, I think, is that of taming Gaia. The idea that nature is something unruly that needs mastery, that needs control. And obviously, this is easy to understand if we look at the picture in the top right, where one flood can wipe out a set of high-speed trains. On the other hand, if we say we take this kind of framing of taming Gaia, it's also very easy to note the gender dimension here, that Gaia is a female, is a woman that needs to be tamed, that is kind of exceeding her boundaries. But I think basically that's what, for example, the idea of planetary stewardship is trying to get at. Like Earth system governance is trying to provide an answer to the Anthropocene by doubling down on controlling the system, on managing not just an ecosystem, but the whole planet. And famous tools to understand planetary stewardship, such as, for example, the planetary boundaries, can be, of course, extremely useful in understanding the kind of ecological limits that might be there. But I think if we go too deep into these tools, um, they might also have another side, namely they allow for the idea of, say, optimal resource exploitation. Because if you say we have a limit here that we can't cross, that's one thing, but it also immediately raises the idea of exploiting up to that limit. And there will always be the call for more resources, more growth. So if we have something like the planetary boundaries, then in a way, having that concept of a straight line that you can go up to safely actually makes it more likely that the boundary will be crossed. And of course, this is very much dominated by our urban century, by our urban world. And cities are basically the phenomenon that we currently see that are eating up most of these resources, either locally or, of course, remotely as well, invisible to the people who live in the cities. Part of that is, I think, rooted in the fact that cities are still kind of seen as unnatural phenomena, where cities are the most human space for us, where obviously everything is built for humans, by humans, and we really don't see a lot of place for non-human agency in cities. There's also the long-standing myth in the view of human history that the city is something that arose from a historically growing kind of social structure, and that a city and the wonders that the city brings with it, for example, in terms of culture and in terms of city life, requires hierarchies in social order. But that, I think, is very much a myth. And for example, books like The Dawn of Everything have recently shown that there is archaeological evidence for cities that do not have this kind of social order. And I think if we think a bit further, this also opens the potential for a city that does not strictly control non-human agency. But if we look at the history, or let's say the recent history of kind of research on urban nature and research on nature for urban planning, what we see is basically one main idea. Nature is a tool. And while we have changing terminologies, I think the mindset behind this persists. So we know since the 80s and 90s that we should probably have more green space in cities because it improves human well-being. But that didn't really change city planning to such a degree that it would actually change the whole picture or that it would make cities more sustainable. So basically what researchers tried is they changed the name. Let's say we use the term ecosystem services. Maybe that allows us to sell it a bit better, but it still didn't really move the needle that much. So the next term that was kind of brought out was green infrastructure. Obviously, we are spending lots and lots of money on roads and gray infrastructure. So maybe if we frame urban nature, city nature as infrastructure, then there will be more investment. To some degree, maybe, but still not as much as needed. So what we see now, the latest kind of iteration is nature-based solutions, which is of course something that I think sells very well to to politicians and I guess in some way also to kind of the European political mindset. But it is still the same mindset, I would say, nature as a tool. And if we look at who is kind of using the idea of nature-based solutions right now, at the bottom right, we see companies like Shell, the same companies that are burning up the planet. So that should make us stop to think about if these kind of ideas and concepts that we are using here are really the right concepts to make sure that cities are not just for humans, but also for other life. A very, very important kind of departure from this mindset, I think, was a recent report by the IPBES on diverse values and valuation of nature, because at least I get the impression that this was kind of the first time that in a mainstream international biodiversity policy space that of course is also very influential in terms of urban planning, we see the acknowledgement that there is something more than the mindset of nature as a tool. So here we see that there's the concept of living from nature, but there are also at least 3 different other approaches. And while I would say nature as a tool is very much the living from approach, to see nature as a resource, throughout human history and through different cultures, there are different approaches. And these are approaches that we can at least learn from when we want to look at different approaches to both sustainability and to urban planning. So this is something that I think is still making the rounds, and it's also noteworthy that this report is being translated into other languages. It has been really, really helpful for me teaching in Japanese in Japan to work with a Japanese version of this report. And for me, I think that's a sign that we are seeing actual change in the conceptual space around cities and around sustainability. But talking about sustainability, what's actually wrong with sustainability? So here I think it merits going back to the definition of sustainability. And one thing that's interesting is that sustainability as a concept is not very young. It goes back to, for example, German forestry management. But the definition that we work with today when we talk about sustainability is actually not that old. And that definition or our understanding of sustainability has, however, changed a little bit over the last, let's say, 50 years or so. In the beginning, there was basically the idea that if you have a triple bottom line, if you take care of the economy, of society, and of the environment, then in the middle somewhere you'll find a space that is probably sustainable. As a reaction to that, you had people who said, well, that sounds good, But in reality, if you invest a lot into the environment, then you probably have a trade-off happening. Then you can't invest as much into society or into economy. So this is usually called the weak sustainability approach, which was then criticized by the strong sustainability folks who argued, wait a second, if you have no environment, it means there will be also no society. And if you want an economy, then you get your economy only with a society and with an environment. So this is basically, I would say, there's still some discussion going on in the sustainability field, but I would say strong sustainability could reasonably be called the consensus at the current time. However, one issue with that is that it is still kind of reductionist, because environment, that word is doing a lot of work here. There's a lot in that box, a lot of species, a lot of life, a lot of complexity that gets really, really strongly reduced down. Same is true for society. What about non-human societies, for example? And what about economies that are not necessarily based on a market approach? All of these kind of get, well, swept aside with this kind of simplified model here. And when we looked at the multi-species sustainability approach, we had a long discussion. What is actually the main problem? Is it anthropocentricity, or is it simply just reductionism? And we basically arrived at the conclusion that it is probably reductionism at the core, and that you can trace back to the human nature dualism that is often associated with the philosopher Descartes and his strict separation of mind and body. And I think this is also a concept that the ECOLOPES project is using in its setup, which I found very interesting. So I think in ways that we are often not aware of, this dualism is not just a philosophical abstract concept, but this is one way of making sense of the world for us. You and me, us and them, society and nature, subject and object. We draw lines because it makes things easier, and because the figure on the left is much clearer and easier to understand. The only problem with the left part of the figure is that that is not really how the world works. Reality is much better described, I would say, by the messy, chaotic mix of lines on the right. So whether we think about human relations or relations in an ecosystem, or even the relations between us and the bacteria in our gut, we are looking at complex entanglements. And as microbiome research makes clear, it is surprisingly hard to even decide where the boundaries are between them and us. So the more we learn about the world, the harder it becomes to simply draw a line to separate here and there. And coming out of my PhD on informal green spaces almost 10 years ago now, with a feeling that by dissecting these spaces into ecology and geography and planning, and staring at the parts I had somehow missed the larger picture, I kept looking for approaches that went beyond simply, declaring everything a socio-ecological entity. Because while that avoids cutting things into parts, it also kind of doesn't really explain much. And that's when I got to kind of relational approaches. And so fortunately, there are alternatives to this kind of dualism and reductionism. And indeed, when we think about sustainability, the societies and cultures with the best long-term track record of sustainability are overwhelmingly indigenous societies. And indigenous scholars are at the forefront in research on relational perspectives. So together with work across a number of humanities, social sciences, and natural science fields, I think this change towards more relational perspectives is rapidly reshaping our worldview. And a couple of quotes from some key scholars here. As Robin Wall-Kimmerer says, in a very ecological way, everybody lives downstream. So what everybody does affects the rest. And that thing says that human nature is always an interspecies relationship. Donna Haraway says that becoming human is always becoming with somebody and something else. And as we slowly expand our knowledge, we start to reevaluate things that were long looked down upon as simple. For example, plants and their abilities. For example, microbes and their ability to communicate. And finally, I think what's emerging from there is basically the revolutionary idea that other than humans have agency, have means to shape the world, different from us maybe, but it's still there. And what multi-species thinking does is it kind of tries to combine these different ideas into an analytical framework. So multi-species thinking, I think you could say, is part of a larger quest in the social sciences and humanities to replace the dualist ontologies by relational perspectives. And it tries to highlight the intersections between ecological relations, the political economy, and cultural representations. And one of the main points is that if we want to really understand social and cultural phenomena, we need to recognize the agency of non-human species, including plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. And before Corona, this was actually kind of hard to explain sometimes. But after Corona, you just need to think 100 years into the future. A future historian will have to basically deal with Corona to explain what they see. So it's kind of obvious now how we are not the only people who are shaping the world. So what we need is entanglements with human lives, landscapes, and technologies must be theoretically integrated into any account of existence. Our model needs to combine these entanglements. Otherwise, it simply doesn't describe the real world. And of course, that brings us to the idea that humans and other life forms and their well-being are interconnected and inseparable. And that's where the sustainability connection point comes in, because sustainability is all about well-being. We can visualize that, for example, by avoiding simply sticking everything into the environment or society and breaking it a little bit up and say, okay, let's put the basics that support life on Earth into here, and then say, okay, that makes possible microbial society, that makes possible plant societies, that makes possible animal societies. And only then do you get human societies. Only then do you get human economies. And only then do you get the formal economies that most of the news is obsessed with. But you can also look at this in terms of shared agency. In that case, what you can do is you can say, okay, let's take all of the life we have on Earth. Let's see how the Earth system is shaped by these different life forms. And then let's put the humans on this map and see how we as humans are actually only one single line leading to the kind of concerted thing that creates the Earth system. So it kind of changes our perspective on the Earth as a whole, but also on our place in the universe, you could say. And with this in mind, we asked, so what happens if we think about the sustainability definition and try to put in all of these other life forms? And this is the definition that we arrived at. We basically said, let's try out this kind of definition, which goes multi-species sustainability means meeting the diverse, changing, and interdependent and irreducibly inseparable needs of all species of the present, while enhancing the ability of future generations of all species to meet their own needs. So you might recognize some parts of the original sustainability definition, but you also see that some important parts are different. What we did next is we thought, okay, what are the principles that would kind of emerge from this new definition? And I would like to showcase them now. So one is the idea of well-being. Obviously, we're not talking just about human well-being anymore. And it's obvious that even human well-being cannot be met just independently, but it also always requires the needs of other species to be met, even if we just talk about food. So that means that the state of two or more species interdependent needs being met could be called multispecies well-being. So here we have basically a new target for sustainability. And if we think about this in terms of cities, if cities are to be sustainable, basically, we would argue the needs of other species must be met in addition to the local human stakeholder needs. And that immediately leads to the question what those non-human needs are and what a city might look like that meets them. But of course, a much larger question spanning disciplines basically is what kind of urban relations are or could be contributing to such mutual well-being, or which ones are one way and thus potentially exploitative? So this is basically a really, really large question. Talking about stakeholders, the next point would then be to expand the notion of stakeholders across species lines. Multi-species well-being obviously emerges from and depends upon a set of complex relations shaped by modern human agency and the transformative potential of all members involved, even though that might look different from species to species. So, say a fox will express its agency in a different way than an invasive plant. And so from this derives the need for multi-species stakeholders, especially we need ways to represent the needs of other species in human multi-stakeholder spaces, which already struggle with representing all human stakeholders, right? So again, this is a very, very large task, I would say. Especially in cities, human urban planning, can that be expanded to include dogs, rats, moths, street trees, lichen, bumblebees, or all the other species we are trying to currently recruit as nature-based solutions? Can these non-human stakeholders be involved in urban policymaking, planning, and design? And what you see at the bottom here is an approach that my colleague Natalie Osborne at Griffith uses in her public engagement course for urban planners, where role play is basically used to have the students represent different species and different stakeholders in an urban planning policy process. The third point that is really, really important, and I would say a large departure from the original sustainability definition, is that multi-species well-being exposes the logical fallacy of maximizing human well-being at the expense of others in a trade-off calculation. I would argue if we go down to the core of well-being, it's relation-based and not resource-based. So that means we're not talking about a zero-sum game. If you can create new relations with, for example, other urban species that can add to your well-being without necessarily consuming more resources. So that means that we shouldn't be content with simply not reducing the resources. We should say that meeting the needs of the present should enhance and not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs, with the goal of increasing multi-species well-being over time. With the current sustainability definition, what happens is, as soon as you degrade the ecosystem, you don't have as much resources as before. And actually getting that part back has proven to be really, really difficult. So I think same as with the kind of trying to exploit the planetary boundaries, we should aim beyond that. We should ask, can we increase the planetary boundaries through a relation-based approach? And cities, I think, are a great example for this. Done well, you can have one place be the source of immense joy for a lot of people beyond just the local residents through beneficial relations made possible by proximity and access. So the pigeon paradox and research on wider effects on urban nature contact is a famous example. How much opportunities urban residents and especially children have to engage with other species can change their support for environmental policies, including conservation policies. So in essence, cities, I think, could be living campuses for multi-species environmental education. And I'll come back to this idea when I talk about our multi-species campus project example. The next two principles are variety and operational autonomy. And for this, we borrowed a little bit from cybernetics. Obviously, functioning management of something as extremely high variety as urban, human, non-human ecosystems requires self-regulating systems, representing and experimenting while continuously renegotiating the complex, entangled multi-species interests. And that means you cannot simply control everything top-down, because your control system always would need more complexity than the system you're trying to control. That's a basic cybernetics trend. So such systems rely on and respect multi-species agency and aim to provide all species with the operational autonomy necessary to meet their needs. And if we look beyond cities, many of the best practices here have been developed by indigenous peoples and are already part of traditional ecological knowledge systems. To kind of illustrate the point a little bit, on the bottom left, you see two examples. You see a system of very strong human control, a plantation where both variety and non-human autonomy has been strongly limited to make management easier. On the right, we have a system where multi-species interactions are largely regulating what is going on, with human intervention that complements these interactions. In the context of cities, I think this hints at just how radically our idea of cities will need to be rethought to make them both capable of supporting highly diverse living communities and generous rather than exploitative in contributing on a landscape or even a global scale. And finally, sustainability is always not just about the now, but also about the future. So multi-species well-being, I think, can be pursued combining different ways of anticipating futures that exist among different species with the specific anticipatory capacities of the human species being used to create better futures for the entire Earth system, and not just being used to plan ahead for better exploitation. So 2 points are there kind of interesting to me. One is the fact that different species have indeed very different ways, not just of anticipating the future, but also very different sensory capabilities entirely. So that leads to completely different experiences, including that of time. And thinking about multi-species cities as experienced through the eyes of a fox or a rat, or maybe even like in this picture here, a 10,000-year-old clonal forest as a part of a city park, for example, might drastically alter how we conceptualize cities. The second is a new perspective on urban futures broadening perspectives on what kind of futures might be possible and what kind might be desirable to include non-human needs might help us move beyond what we have learned cities are supposed to look like. And to drive home the importance of the multi-species part in sustainability, what we did in the paper is we did a thought experiment. Basically, you have your standard 4 different scenarios, 2 axes. One is sustainable, unsustainable, the horizontal axis, and the other is anthropocentric or multi-species oriented. And obviously today we sit firmly in the bottom left, a race to the bottom, focused on human needs and unsustainable. If we start to care about other species without addressing sustainability, we get to the top left. If we get to the bottom right, we get the standard kind of sustainability approach, which you could call, I think, nature serves man. Again, it brings with it a need to completely monitor everything to make sure you're not going beyond the boundaries. It also means that consumption needs to be rationalized and that you need to actually then enforce this again to avoid overshoot. So you run into a lot of issues there that you actually don't want to have, I would say. Then on the top left, if you try to care about other species, but you don't manage to actually make the city or make the planet sustainable, what happens is, I think, we're left with triaging species extinctions. Basically, what we're also seeing already happening now. We try to make trade-offs. We try to find out where are the places we should absolutely protect, where are the places that maybe we have to let go. But it also risks, I think, sliding into ecofascism, where nature needs to be protected from those with a different skin color or culture from us. And you see some traces of that in Germany as well as in Japan. I think the rhetoric there is basically the same. So that leaves us with the top right scenarios, where we combine sustainability with a multi-species approach. And that basically means that in terms of interdependent needs, means being well-being needs to be largely mutual. So the ideas that most closely, I think, align with this multi-species sustainability approach are degrowth and post-development, sufficiency-oriented economies that provide space for non-human autonomy, but also concepts such as biocultural diversity that emphasize how separating humans from nature in a half-Earth approach, for example, basically ignores how many cultures throughout history have thrived alongside nature and not despite of it. So heading over from concepts to future directions, first, I'd like to think a little bit about future directions for research. One thing we try to do is we apply the multi-species sustainability approach together with a degrowth and post-development approach to agri-food systems. And what we came up with is basically that we have a growth metabolism at the heart of our current global agri-food system that is based on efficiency, extraction, accumulation, private ownership, and control. And if we apply the multi-species sustainability idea together with a kind of post-growth metabolism, we then arrive at new principles, namely sufficiency, regeneration, distribution, commons, and care. And given that for humans, eating is absolutely central, and that if we don't change our current food system alone, for example, will cause catastrophic climate change, I think this is a really, really important piece of the puzzle that we're getting at here. In terms of developing the multi-species sustainability concept further, I think there's still a lot of work to be done looking closely at and expanding the 6 principles that I mentioned earlier to think through the details, to flesh out what it means in different contexts, and then going on to conceptually model human, non-human interactions with sustainability in mind. And I think we're seeing a lot more work being done in that space already. I think one of our listeners today actually has a paper out that looks at this. I think Fabio published a paper looking at human, non-human interactions in cities. And the next step then, of course, is to see, okay, we have the concept of multi-species sustainability, and how would this kind of concept change our view on other fields? So I showed how it already changed our view on agri-food systems, and I'm trying to see what it would do for cities. But beyond that, for example, design, future studies, eco-health, microbiome, or environmental ethics, I think there are probably new ideas to be found in different fields if you change the sustainability approach to include other species. And that's something I hope to slowly explore over the next couple of years. Another big topic, and the question that we usually get a lot when we talk about multi-species sustainability, is how to operationalize the concept and how to assess it. And of course, here, one of the big and important things is how to avoid basically the disaster that the SDGs have become, where the paper by Cheng et al. In 2020 showed that you can have progress with the SDG indicators, and that's completely not correlated with actual ecological indicators on the ground, where they write that while most countries are progressing well towards environmental SDGs, this has little relationship with actual biodiversity conservation, and instead better represents socioeconomic development. And further, they write, if this continues, the SDGs will likely serve as a smoke screen for further environmental destruction throughout the decade. So I think operationalizing and assessing is really important, but it also means that we need to be really, really careful if and when we try to assess and monitor multi-species sustainability. One question would be, what kind of indicators could work? What kind of indicators are there that can assess, for example, both bottom-up or top-down approaches, say local monitoring or global monitoring on an individual community species scale? Are there indicators that manage to capture the relational approach that is so difficult to capture usually? And I think that's also really important to acknowledge both the importance of measuring and trying to measure, but also the limits of measurements. And then finally, to see how this could be integrated, say, in IPBES assessments, or maybe even into IPCC assessments and things like that. So that's enough for research. A couple of experiments that where my colleagues and I and others are trying to explore where this idea could be taken. One is, for example, multi-species stakeholder planning workshops like this, which at least are a lot of fun to do with the students, even though it turns out it's actually really hard to role play another species. Another tool that we try to develop is this multi-species stakeholder policy framework. In this case, we used bees because we were working with Japanese honeybees in Kyoto, which are native species that have still a strong relation to humans. And there we kind of found that borrowing the donut economic model, on the one side, of course, you have the needs of the bee. On the other side, you also have the needs of the stewards, who are kind of the conduit between the bees and the rest of humanity, I guess you could say. You also have certain requirements of the public. So there's a need, for example, for environmental knowledge to make sure that they know, okay, this is a bee and not a wasp. Maybe I should call the beekeeper and not the exterminator. And of course, there are certain things in governance that basically decide if a bee can live in this urban area or not, or even in a non-urban area for that. So that's a tool that we are trying to apply. Another collaboration that was really fun was with the National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation in Tokyo that ended last year, which was focused on microbes. And they asked us to join as kind of advisors. And as part of that, together with a landscape designer, we decided that actually in the museum, in the exhibition, we want a kind of tiny garden because that's actually how you give people the chance to be inside the microbes and actually interact with the microbes other than the highly sterile exhibition environment. We are also trying to see if we can use kind of the university as an institution and the campus as a space to make the campus into a place not just for students and staff, but also for a community and also for non-human beings. Because at the end of the day, the campus is already kind of co-created by different species and depends on other species as well. So the ideas that we find in multi-species sustainability hold true in something like a campus environment as well. And if you use this concept, we think there's a lot of potential on the one hand to kind of make the campus into a symbol of sustainable society. For example, the campus where I teach at in Ehime is kind of known to be the most conservative prefecture in Japan, maybe not unlike Bavaria. And if the university doesn't manage to show the kind of future we want and need to build, then we kind of expect that society will say, well, if the university can't do it, we certainly can't do it. So I think there is kind of a need for the universities to really step up the game here, including through partnerships, of course. And what we've been trying, for example, is we looked at thermal comfort to see what the current state of the university campus is. And we found that we already have really, really dangerous wet bulb globe temperatures that make the campus unsafe, well, for human life, but also for non-human life. For example, in July, we try to invite more species onto the campus. Recently, we just put in native beehives in association with the university-affiliated high school. So as part of a high school science project, we did kind of coexistence workshops where we brainstormed with students and staff what kind of species we know already on campus, what kind of species we would like to invite to the campus. We also tried to kind of do a fun experiment that they tried in Melbourne with street trees, where we gave the trees QR codes and you can basically write a message to the tree, and the tree, if you're lucky, the tree writes back, which also was a fun thing to do. We also worked with a landscape designer to see if we can come up with a kind of different design vision for the campus. Obviously, this is a bit far out and will take a lot of time to implement, but an important part here for us is to kind of break up our ideas of the campus as it is right now and see more of what the campus could be like, possibly, and to get started with the process of questioning if everything has to be like it is right now. That also is basically the work that we're trying to do with the science fiction anthologies that are at least implicitly using the multispecies sustainability idea. In the first anthology, we tried to, we invited writers to reimagine cities from a multi-species perspective. And in the second anthology that was just published in January, what we did was we explicitly asked for the protagonists to be non-human and see what kind of stories emerge from that. And the idea there was also that as researchers, maybe we don't always have the best ideas, and we are probably not paid for our creativity, but there are people out there who are. So we thought, let's work together with them and invite writers and artists. So for the second anthology, we actually include artwork in the book, including this small collaboration between a concept artist and me, where we kind of have a setting in the future where a researcher travels to different cities that have taken multi-species approaches and describe through stories what happened there, how these cities came to be, who is living there, what the multi-species relations are like, and kind of through that provide a visual and story-based way to imagine a different kind of city and different kind of futures. So with that, I think I'm more or less out of time, but I'm also at the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed this tour de force through a lot of concepts and ideas, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Follow us in this shift to multi-species design through ECOLOPES. Find out more about our research on www.ecolopes.org and on our social media platforms.